The erosion of the dollar, a historical perspective on inflation in the USA. Inflation, the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising and subsequently purchasing power is falling, has been a persistent part of economic life in the United States. Over the decades, Americans have witnessed their currency's purchasing power dwindle, a phenomenon often referred to as the debasement of the dollar. This video explores the trajectory of inflation in the USA from the 1950s to the present day, highlighting real-life examples that illustrate the profound impact of inflation on the everyday lives of Americans. The 1950s, the post-war boom. The 1950s are often remembered as a golden era of economic prosperity in the United States. Coming out of World War II, the country experienced a booming economy with relatively low inflation rates, averaging around 2% annually. During this decade, a dollar could buy a gallon of gas for about 27 cents, and the average price of a new house was around $73.54. A loaf of bread cost approximately 14 cents, showcasing the strong purchasing power of the dollar. The 1960s, the Great Society in Vietnam. The 1960s saw the introduction of expansive social programs under President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, alongside increased military spending due to the Vietnam War. These expenditures began to put upward pressure on prices. By the end of the decade, inflation rates had started to creep up, reaching 5.5% by 1969. Despite this, a dollar still held considerable value, with gas prices hovering around 31 cents per gallon by the decade's end. The 1970s, stagflation hits hard. The 1970s were marked by the phenomenon of stagflation, a period of high inflation combined with stagnant economic growth and high unemployment. Triggered by the 1973 oil crisis and compounded by a second oil shock in 1979, inflation rates soared, peaking at over 13% by 1979. The purchasing power of the dollar plummeted. By the end of the decade, a gallon of gas cost 86 cents, more than tripling in price from the beginning of the decade. The average price of a new home had escalated to $58,500 by 1979, reflecting the severe impact of inflation on the housing market. The 1980s, taming inflation. The early 1980s witnessed aggressive monetary policies under Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker aimed at curbing inflation through high interest rates. These measures successfully reduced inflation from its double-digit highs in the late 1970s to 3.2% by 1983. However, the cost was a deep recession, with significant short-term economic pain. By the mid-1980s, the economy had begun to recover and inflation was kept under control, albeit at the expense of those who suffered through the recession. The 1990s to early 2000s, the Great Moderation. The period from the mid-1980s through the early 2000s is often referred to as the Great Moderation, characterized by low inflation and stable economic growth. Technological advancements and globalization contributed to keeping prices relatively stable. During this period, the dollar's purchasing power remained more stable than in previous decades, although it continued to erode at a slower pace. For example, by the year 2000, a gallon of gas cost around $1.26, and the average price of a new home was approximately $134,000. The 2010s to today, a new era of challenges. The aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis saw historically low interest rates and significant monetary expansion, laying the groundwork for future inflationary pressures. While inflation remained relatively subdued for much of the 2010s, the COVID-19 pandemic's economic disruptions led to a resurgence of inflationary pressures. Supply chain disruptions, increased government spending, and recovering demand have pushed inflation rates to levels not seen since the early 1980s, with the Consumer Price Index, CPI, hitting annual increases of around 7% by 2021. Today, the purchasing power of the dollar is a fraction of what it was in the 1950s. Real-life examples of inflation's impact are stark. A gallon of milk costs over $6, a dozen eggs can be more than $5, and the average price of a new home exceeds $500,000 in many parts of the country. The minimum wage, despite increases, has not kept pace with inflation, eroding the standard of living for many Americans. Conclusion. The historical trajectory of inflation in the USA tells a story of economic cycles, policy responses, and the constant erosion of the dollar's purchasing power. From the post-war boom of the 1950s to the present day, Americans have navigated the challenges of inflation in various ways. Understanding this history is crucial for policymakers, economists, and citizens as they face the inflationary pressures of today and tomorrow, seeking strategies to preserve the value of their currency and the well-being of their economy. To learn about how precious metals IRAs can help you protect and preserve your retirement plan in times of turmoil, including high inflation's erosion of the dollar's buying power, visit our website at givemethegold.com to learn more and see our list of recommended companies to invest with.
See our report of the top-rated gold IRA companies of the year and more information on gold IRAs and other precious metals investing in our informative website at givemethegold.com. We look forward to seeing you soon. See our